Greetings YouTube and the World Wide Web. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Josh, and with a recent sale of a, get this, $6,000 vintage t-shirt, yes, you see it right here, everybody and their mother is now out looking for vintage tees. Vintage tees are extremely hot, and today we're going to talk about how you can identify whether or not your t-shirt is in fact vintage. Let's go. So I think it's safe to say that not every vintage tee you're going to find is going to bring you a $6,000 payday. But there certainly are lots and lots of $100 plus vintage t-shirts out there for you to find. So the market is extremely hot right now. I know this year alone I've sold several $600 plus t-shirts, so it's definitely a possibility. It is important to note that t-shirts are vintage once they are about 20 years old. It can be a little bit fuzzy on either side of that 20-year mark. But generally speaking, 20 years is the number. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started on identifying vintage t-shirts. As illustrations, we have two vintage Batman tees. And we'll use elements of these guys to help you determine whether or not your t-shirt may be vintage. Now, you may have already heard the term single stitch in relation to t-shirts. And this is in reference to the stitching used to create the tee and the construction of it. In the mid-90s to the late 90s, the industry transitioned to what's called a double stitch. I'm going to show you an example of a single stitch right here. Here in this Batman tee, you can see it's one single stitch on the sleeve. And that single stitch method would be used throughout the rest of the garment. And so if you have a t-shirt with a single stitch, you can be pretty confident that t-shirt was produced prior to the mid to late 90s. To be fair, there are some exceptions, but as a general rule, this remains true. Just because your t-shirt may have a double stitch does not mean that it's automatically not vintage. You would just have to determine its age with another marker. So the second method in determining whether or not your t-shirt is vintage is whether or not it has a tag. In the early 2000s, t-shirt manufacturers began to transition away from physical tags. Certainly they still exist, but you find a lot of t-shirts nowadays just have this information printed on the inside of the t-shirt. So if you have a physical tag sewn into your t-shirt, you have a better candidate for a vintage tee. Now you'll need some more information, and that's where this comes in. And that is if it's made in the USA. In the late 90s, companies began outsourcing textile production to foreign countries, and so a lot of the textiles that we were making for years and years were no longer being made here. And that is a general marker because it's about 20 years from this moment that that transition started happening. So any t-shirt that was made in the USA is most likely vintage. You can find out if your t-shirt is made in the USA by looking at the tag. So this t-shirt was clearly made in the USA, has a single stitch and a physical tag, so we're on the right track. Now the next way to determine whether or not your t-shirt is vintage is to look for the copyright year on the artwork. T-shirts that have value typically have a particular piece of art that is important to the collector. Here we have a Batman Returns tee, and since we know that it's old from the 90s and the movie Batman Returns was a movie made in the 90s, we can be pretty confident this is a vintage t-shirt from the 90s. One way in which we can determine when this was produced is to look at that copyright number. You can see that this artwork was produced in 1991. Now this method can be tricky, and let me explain why. Take this Batman tee for instance, single stitch. It had a sewn-in tag, but it's been torn out. But we have down here a copyright date. Now notice that this t-shirt is copyright 1968. Well, remember, that's the copyright for the artwork. This t-shirt was produced in the late 80s, not in the late 60s. So that can be one way you can get thrown off because that copyright date can just be associated with the art. Now remember, because that year date has to do with the art and not the production of the t-shirt, you may have to use the other factors in determining whether or not you have a reprint or an actual vintage t-shirt. So I hope, guys, that that was a bit helpful. Vintage t-shirts are a lot of fun. They're extremely fun to collect, extremely fun to find because there's so many different rare pieces out there. Maybe you will have the next $6,000 t-shirt banger. But until then, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell to be reminded when we post. We will see you guys in the next one. Peace.